time I was here was quite a few years ago, actually. I think 2013. And I got a letter from the church saying, hey, send some pictures and things of your ministry, the church planting that you're doing. And so I got a hold of Brother Steve and said, listen, here's a better idea. Just let me come. So he said, oh, yeah. So we're here to do that today in the Sunday school hour and then preach in the morning service as well. But I appreciate you folks. I appreciate your prayers and your support for what we're doing. And in fact, this was the first church that supported us when we launched into this ministry. Your pastor did that, and I appreciate that so much. And so God is blessing, and we'll get to that in a few moments. But let me just share with you from Romans chapter 10 a little bit about the burden that God put upon my heart. Now, I've actually been involved in church planting since 1975. When my wife and I graduated from Bible college, we launched out, went back to our home area in Chicago and started a church. And I realized that I was a young guy, I was 21, and I realized I don't know enough to really pastor this church, but we can get it going. And so after about 2 years, the Lord had blessed the church. It had grown. In fact, we started with average 10 people our first month, and by our 4-month anniversary, we hit 111 people. And then it just kind of kept going. So it was, but again, I felt like, you know what, I'm going to get someone else to pastor. I'm going to go start another church. And we did that another time. And then we did it another time. And through that, we gained a lot of experience. And I've been back to every one of those churches and preached multiple times since we left. So that's the good news along the way. For 15 years, we did kind of a little bit of a turn. I was at Trinity Baptist College, served there as the executive vice president, then ultimately the president of the college for 15 years. And our burden there was to help young guys from the college go out and start churches, which they did. And so that was a thrill. That was a desire of our heart as well. So we've been at it 11 years now. We left there, launched into this ministry full time. So in Romans chapter 10, this verse God used to really speak to my heart. It says in verse 1, brethren, my heart's desire, and of course this is the Apostle Paul speaking, my heart's desire and prayer to God for Israel is that they might be saved. And I don't believe that we do any disrespect to this passage if we insert the word America in place of the word Israel. So when we think of that way, brethren, my heart's desire and prayer to God for America is that they might be saved. And I hope that you have that same burden. It does not take... does not take a scientist to figure out our country's not headed in the right direction. We have multiple issues that we're dealing with on just so many levels, but for me, spiritual level and moral level are the most important of all those levels. And the answer, of course, is, wow, what are we going to do? How do we deal with that? You know, it's interesting. The question that's often asked by a politician when he's running for office against a politician that is in office is this question: are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? You might remember Ronald Reagan asked that question when he was running against Jimmy Carter. Are you better off today than you were 4 years ago? I think a better question for us is this: are we better off today than we were a generation ago or 2 generations ago? And I think any honest person would say, while we've grown in technology and military might, we are much worse off spiritually, and we are much worse off morally in our country. So the question is, what can we do? What can, as believers, what can we do? And obviously that's the answer to that question. I don't possess all of that. I know where to pray, amen. And in my heart, we've just got to strengthen churches. We've got to plant churches in areas where there are few, and we need to strengthen churches that remain and do what we can to be a blessing and a help to pastors all across the country. So the hope is not in the White House. And no matter who gets into that office, that's not the hope. The hope is the church house, God's people doing what God has called us to do. So I hear people often ask the question, boy, don't we have enough churches? Why plant more churches? Typically, those are people that live in the South. Because in the South, you understand. I mean, I live in Jacksonville, and Jacksonville is a city just under 1 million people. And we have about 600 Baptist churches in Jacksonville alone. That's a lot of churches. Now, if you go out to Portland, Oregon, which is equivalent in size, you would probably be hard-pressed to find 20 churches like your church in that city, and in Seattle and other places as well. But I would tell you, we plant churches first and foremost because it's a biblical thing to do. We know that. You go back into the Old Testament, or excuse me, into the New Testament, and the Apostle Paul was a church planter. That's what he did. He went and planted churches, and he told us to do the same thing. And, of course, that's what the Great Commission is. You go to a city, you start preaching the Bible and winning people to Christ. Before long, you got a little nucleus and you start a church. And that's how you get the job done. That's what it's all about. But on that platform of it being biblical, let me also say that there's just some alarming statistics that would convince, I think, any reasonable person that we need to plant churches in America. Let me give you one. I'll just give you a few of them. First of all, in 1920, so go back 100 years. In 1920, there were 27 churches for every 10,000 Americans. Okay? By 1950, there were 17 churches for every 10,000 Americans. By 1996, there were 10 churches for every 10,000 Americans. And today, there's 8 churches for every 10,000 Americans. Now, understand, when I say church, I don't mean like Landmark. I'm saying anything with a steeple. Anything. They call themselves a church, irrespective of denomination. So in that number, 8 for every 10,000 Americans would be Episcopalians and Catholics and just right down the line, not just Baptist. So my point is, my gracious, we're not going in the right direction. We're going in the opposite direction. Here's an interesting statistic. There was an incredible book written a number of years ago, just, 4 or 5 years ago. And they surveyed over 200,000 churches in America. Now keep in mind, there's somewhat more than that, but not vastly more than that. They surveyed these churches, and here's what they discovered. That only 8.9% of the population of our country will attend on a given Sunday an evangelical church. Now, evangelical is a broader term than we would use. Typically, we would call ourselves fundamental. Evangelical basically is any church that believes the Bible and tries to get people saved. That's kind of a wide definition. 8.9%, which tells us that roughly 90% of America isn't in a church even close to this on a given Sunday. Now, again, when you're down south, sometimes it gets murky because you know more Christians and you see more churches, and it's hard sometimes to put that together. But I guarantee you, I grew up in Chicago. When I was a kid there, they had 3 million people within the city limits, about 8.5 to 9 million people in the metro area. And I'd be hard-pressed to name 20 churches like your church. And I grew up there. I mean, the reality is there are places where what you experience every week, and sadly what often we take for granted, doesn't exist in our country in many places. And it's sad. That same survey revealed that only 16.5% attend any Christian church, call it whatever, if they say they're Christian on a given weekend. And then Gallup just came out with a survey, interestingly, in 2021, just I think in May or March rather of this year. And they say only 47% of our nation is even a member of a church. Whether they attend is not the issue. Whether they support it is not the issue. What kind of a church is not the issue. That is the first time in their survey that it ever went below the 50% mark. So by any metric, we are really not doing well in this country. Here's a third statistic. Do you realize in the last decade, on average, every year, some 4,000 churches went out of business? Closed their doors. Done. We are endeavoring to get our hands on some of those buildings so that we can get a fiery preacher in there and see that building come alive again to reach lost people with the gospel. So that is sad, 4,000 churches. Now, not all of those are churches like this, but nonetheless, 4,000 churches closing their doors. And by the way, those buildings are being turned into condos and restaurants and just anything imaginable. we need to get our hands on those buildings and have churches birth churches and see those buildings used for what they were intended to be used for. Let me give you one last statistic. From the year 2000 to 2018, so we got roughly a 19-year span, the population of the United States increased by 45,539,307, or 730, according to the Population Bureau. So 45.5 million people. That is greater than the population of Belgium, Greece, Sweden, Switzerland, Albania, and Iceland combined. So in roughly 19 years, population-wise, we birthed Belgium, Greece, Sweden, Switzerland, Albania, and Iceland inside of our boundaries. And that, by the way, is legal immigration. We're not talking about the illegal immigration. These are people that have been born and came in legally, subtracting the deaths. That's the plus net gain, over 45.5 million people. So just on the population metric, even if all of the churches in America that we have, those 8 that are out there for 10,000 Americans, if every one of those were Bible-believing, soul-winning, missionary-minded churches, if every one of those, we're losing ground just on the basis of the growth rate of our country. So obviously we've got to see that change. And God put that burden on my heart. Many others are involved in that as well, and we founded a ministry called Church Planting America. We have like 6 objectives, strategic objectives. The first, of course, and the one we're most diligent about is planting new churches. But we also recognize that it's important to make churches that are in existence healthy. So what can we do to help churches that might be struggling? I have probably in my phone 35 to 40 young pastors that are pastoring for the first time. And quite frankly, there's not a week that goes by, and I mean that in sincerity. Many of those, or several of those, will connect with me. Ricky Draper, I was telling Brother Steve about that last night. He's called me a couple times on issues that he's facing. You're out there pastoring a church for the first time, and you got a lot of questions, and you don't have a lot of answers. And I hear this repeatedly, and I think they mean it as an insult since I led the college. We didn't learn this in college. We didn't learn this in college. We didn't learn this in college. And I said, well, I think some of you did learn it, but some of you are sleeping in class. So there, that may balance it out a little bit. I'm not sure if you got it or you didn't. I mean, we did our best, but I don't care. There's not a school in the world that can tell you everything you're going to face when you get into it. It's just tough. And so we're trying to help those young guys as well. And so, yes, our thrust is planting new churches, but it's also, by the grace of God, trying to be a blessing and a help and throw a lifeline to a young guy out there that's trying to figure out how to get this done. And, many of these churches that these young pastors go to are churches they have more problems than people, to be real honest with you. And that's why the last pastor left. And that's why the church has got 30 folks and have had 30 folks for the last 10, 12 years. It's just they need help. And so we have about 30 or 40 written resources that we have on our website, all kinds of things to try to help. And we're constantly developing new materials, training materials, teaching materials, anything we can to be a help to these young pastors and church planters out there. So our little slogan is this: impacting America one church at a time. That's our heartbeat. Impacting America one church at a time. So you folks, as I said a moment ago, you got on the bandwagon early to help us with this. And so all of the results and all of the blessings that we have, by the grace of God, been able to see and realize, you folks here have a part in that, whether you realize that or not. It's like supporting a missionary in Africa or South America or wherever. When they go out and see somebody saved and a life gets changed and people are baptized or a church is planted, whatever, the churches here in America that support and pray for, not just financially, but prayer support that missionary, you can feel good about that. You had a part in that. And that's exactly how I feel about you folks in that regard. Someone said this: if you want to grow something to last a season, plant flowers. If you want to grow something to last a lifetime, plant trees. But if you want to grow something that will last throughout eternity, plant a church. And so we're trying to put that little concept into play in church planting. So what do we have on the screen, if you want to do that? Who's ever back there? Is he back there? Is it on the screen? Oh, it's on. I was looking for it here. I thought maybe it was going to pop up here. If it can pop up here, that'd be great. I don't know if we can do that. Then I can walk you through it a little bit easier. But church planting in America. So we're just going to take you through some of the churches that God has given us the opportunity to connect with to help these young church planters. And so if we can start with the first guy, whomever that is on there. Okay, this is the Taylor Family Beach Baptist Church in New York City. Interesting story here. His pastor asked me to come and preach probably 15 years ago a missions conference in his church in Poplar Bluff, Missouri. And every message, he said, Sunday school, Sunday morning, Sunday night, Monday night, Tuesday night, and Wednesday night, I want it to be on church planting. I want our people to understand what church planting is. So we did that. On Wednesday night, gave the final invitation of that missions conference, and this guy, who was the youth pastor in that church, full-time youth pastor, surrendered to go plant a church. I don't think the pastor had that in mind when he invited us to come in and do that, because he lost this guy. But he came out of that church, that's his family, and their vision, if you understand New York City, it's of course massive, we all know that, but there are so many different neighborhoods and so many different sections in the city, and they're trying to not just plant a church, but continue to plant churches as an itinerant church planter right there in New York City, and they are on their third church right now, and they're eyeing their fourth church as well. And so you remember a few years ago, Superstorm Sandy went up to that part of the country. You might remember that, and things were just devastated, and this is part of that. It came out of that. They went to minister to those people who were hurting, and from that they led people to Jesus, and from that they planted a church. So I was there on, this is one of their services in a rented building. You can go to the next slide. I think there's another one there. And we actually did the organizational service for this church a few years ago, and they're ready to launch their third one. Let's go to the next one. This is the Nate Hesse family, New Life Baptist. This is outside of St. Louis. Interesting story. The young lady, her dad, Brother Steve, you know, Pastor Ralph Flowers, and he has 4 children, and 2 are young men. One is a missionary in France, and one's a missionary in Taiwan. And then this young lady's married to a church planter, and then the other daughter's in Christian service too. So that's a wonderful family that has really emphasized that in their family. And Nate went out and planted this church. You can go to the next one. Yeah, just a couple of pictures there of their facility that they have now. You can go, keep going. Yes, there's their auditorium. And the next one. Let's see. Okay. Anyway, with the Hesses, they actually work through our church planting ministry. One of our missionaries, as are the Taylors. This is the Greg Hoxson family, Grace and Truth Baptist Church out in California. About, I don't know, close to 30 years ago, I was invited to go speak at a Filipino church outside of San Diego. And the first Sunday there were about as many folks, maybe in this side of the auditorium, that were in that church the very first time I spoke. And it was called Filipino American Bible Baptist Church. Well, they've reduced it down to Bible Baptist Church. But at any rate, there were a few white people, as they call us, and then there were all Filipinos. Well, I just kind of fell in love with those people and fell in love with the church there and the pastor, and he's been a friend, and I go back at least every other year. Now that church has grown to be very sizable, and they have actually planted 4 or 5 churches out of their church. But this church was planted out of one of the churches that they originally planted. So this is kind of the granddaughter church to that one that I started with years ago. And there's a crowd on the Sunday that I was there, and just doing well. Most Filipinos, and they are excited about Jesus and leading people to Jesus, and it's just a blessing to be part of that. And the lumpia, if you're familiar with lumpia, the lumpia isn't bad either when I go there. It's like real thin egg rolls, but they're filled with chicken and pork, and I'm telling you, they're out of this world. So when I put my order in for the lumpia, every time I go to a Filipino church, and I'll be back to that mother church in October to do a revival or something there. So I'm looking forward to that. And by the way, when you have something at the mother church, all of the other churches come together for that. They all gather. They call it the mother church. They're all there, which is really interesting to me, because then I get to see all these young pastors that I've worked with through the years, and it's a blessing. Let's go to the next one. The Kevin Byers family. This brother, Kevin, he's the short guy actually in the middle. He was a missionary, and you may have supported him here, I don't know. He was a missionary to Germany for probably 10 or 15 years over there, and did a fantastic job. But he grew up in Oregon, and his burden was to go back and plant a church in Oregon. And he's out of Pastor Rick Adams' church, Brother Steve. And he talked with his preacher and got some advice and ended up coming back. And they meet in a rented facility right now, in like a motel, kind of a banquet room or something. And they start. One thing they do interesting is last year, not this summer that we're pulling out of, but the summer before, even with COVID, they did a tent revival meeting, which you don't hear many churches doing that today. And they did that, and they saw a number of people come to Christ, and 2 or 3 families not just got saved, but got baptized and joined that church that are part of that work. So he did it again this year. And so one thing we do through our ministry is each October, we raise money. We call it National Church Planting Month. And we raise money to help these churches, and maybe it's buy a building or a piece of land or a van or whatever. So we help them this year to be able to do that tent meeting again, because we're so convinced that that was a great evangelistic opportunity for them. Kevin Byers doing a great job there in Astoria. You can go to the next one. This is one of the brand new churches that we're working with, Raleigh Hill. He too was a missionary in South America, and some things changed in that country for their status, and they had to exit. And he came back and starting the church way up. If you know Idaho, there's just this little pencil of a place that kind of goes up to Canada, and that's where they are. They're probably no more than an hour, probably not even an hour from Canada, starting the church. And you can go to the next. Yeah, that's their rented facility that they're using now for their auditorium. And he is a fireball, and he is going to do a great job building a church. And so we've had a joy to be involved in their life and ministry as well. Sweet family for sure, out of a great mother church in Medford, Oregon. You can go to the next one. This is the Addison Smith family, Grants Pass, Oregon. Most of the churches in Oregon are along the I-5 corridor. If you've been out that way, like we have 95 that runs north to south, south to north. Well, that's what they have, Interstate 5. And when you're coming up from California, you hit Medford and then Grants Pass, and you just kind of work your way up. And most of the big cities, Eugene, Springfield, Salem, then you get up to Portland, they're all along that corridor. Most of the churches in the state are in that area, in that corridor. And there was a city called Grants Pass, pretty good sized city, and it's growing. And there's one good church there, a fine young pastor that I've preached for. But the church in Medford, of which this young man is out of, he was the assistant pastor there. They wanted to plant another church there, and so they went and met with the pastor who was there and made sure that he was comfortable, that we're not in competition. Let's figure this out the right way because we don't want to be offensive. And started this church. Now, they're in a rented facility, as you can see there, but doing a great, great job for Christ, and we're thankful for that new church as well. You can go to the next one. This is a brother out in Burns, Wyoming. You say, where is that? I'm not sure he even knows where Burns is if you've been to Wyoming, but it's kind of outside of Cheyenne. And it's interesting story. He went out there to plant this church. Burns actually has a population of probably 100 or 2. That's the population base. They're about 10 or 15 miles, I think, outside of Cheyenne, if I can recall. So they do draw some people from that. And, of course, a lot of ranchers out that way. But go to the next photo here. That's their auditorium. And go to the next one, if there is a next one on this. There isn't. Okay. This young brother, not this guy that's up, but the one from Wyoming, there was a church that owned a camp. And they wanted to sell the camp. And the camp had, if I recall, 33 acres of property and buildings. And they sold it to this new church for like $200,000, they would carry the loan, no interest. So he called me and says, what do we do? I said, you just wasted a dime on the phone call. Buy the property. And there's like 10 or 12 buildings on it, and it's an amazing that God gave them. But there's an overview shot. I thought I had it on there that showed the whole thing, and I mean, it's incredible. Now, they've went into that auditorium that you saw a moment ago, and they went into that auditorium, and they actually remodeled that. And part of our money that we raised in the fall, as I mentioned earlier, went towards that project, and other churches got behind that as well. But he's a fireball. This guy was a student at Trinity when I was there, Jamie Weatherford, and he just wanted to go back to South Carolina and start a church. A lot of our churches, as you're seeing, are out west: California, Oregon, Washington, Idaho, Wyoming, Colorado, that area. But this guy went back to back to South Carolina and started a church. And he had just a little nucleus, a few family members. There may have been 10 or 12 to start with, a couple of families. But he has done a remarkable job. Let's go to the next picture. He built this building, and it doesn't look like much from the outside. He bought 2 acres of property. We helped him buy that property. We helped him buy the next 2 acres. We helped him buy the next 2 acres. We helped him build this building. And if you go to the next one, you'll see the inside of it. It's rather nice. Nice building there. And there may be one other photo on this. I'm not sure. Nope. But anyway, that building, all that land, and that building is debt-free. And that church is not even 10 years old. They're probably about 8 years old now. And by the way, they support missionaries, support our ministry to kind of put back into what God has blessed them with. So he's doing a great job. Blackburn Family. Now, this is an older photo. His kids are much older. In fact, the church that I'm mentioning here, they're no longer there. But I wanted to give credit to him in the sense that this is the guy that started this Faith Baptist Church in Circleville, which is outside of, maybe 45 minutes outside of Columbus, just south of Columbus, Ohio. And this is that building was a church that closed, went out of business, and they were able to get that building. And the mortgage on that building was like $110,000. And you can go to the next shot. I think there's 2 or 3 of theirs. There's the auditorium. There may even be another one, I'm not sure. Nope. At any rate, so that's one of those closed churches that we were able to reclaim by the grace of God and see a young pastor go in there and do a good work for Jesus. This is a family, the Mike Herzig family. Again, this is a Trinity grad. He and his wife, Jody, sweet couple. They, Michael is from Buffalo, New York. He called me one day. He was an assistant pastor there. He called me one day and said, God's put on my heart to start a church. And I said, well, where do you feel God's leading you? He said, well, I grew up in Buffalo. I really want to start in this Buffalo area, this greater Buffalo area. Doesn't have to be right in the city limits, but somewhere in this area. Listen, have you ever been to Buffalo in the winter? You're either called or crazy to go to Buffalo, I guarantee you. That's how I feel about it. I was up there in the winter. And so he started this church up there, New Beginnings. There's the sign out front. Go to the next shot. This is the inside of the auditorium. Now, let me tell you, this building, the church that occupied this building went out of business. So he got this building that has that auditorium that he remodeled, so it's much nicer now than when it was when he got it. It has Sunday school space, it has a gymnasium, and a parsonage with 4 bedrooms for $0. Because when they went out of business, they handed the church off, the property, to another church too far away to do anything with it. And that pastor was just waiting for some church planter to come along with a burden to want to plant a church there. So Michael was that guy. And he started the church, and I was just there in like 2 months ago, I think May, if I'm not mistaken, maybe June, for their 10th anniversary of him planting that church. Now, by the way, they support 13 missionaries at $100 a month out of that church. So, church planting isn't taking money from missions. It's putting money, it's enabling missionaries who have to spend now 3 and 4 years on deputation. It's giving them more contacts to go to raise their money. And so we're grateful, doing a great job. I don't know if there's any more picture of that or if that's all there is to it. This is Huffman family. This fella, boy, oh boy, he came to Trinity. Oh my heavens. I would never have believed that I would be showing his picture in a church house about planting a church. He was as rough could be. He managed the largest beach club in Panama City. If you don't know anything about what that means, that's who he was. He got saved. I mean, like a week after he got saved, the preacher said, hey, you ought to go to Trinity Baptist College. He showed up at Trinity Baptist College. He didn't even own a Bible. He didn't know Genesis from Revelation. Oh my heavens. I can't even begin to tell you the work we had to put into this guy to get him to where he is. My wife and I were out there. He planted the church. We went out, and we pulled in the parking lot. It's City Baptist Church, and it's the roughest area you can possibly start a church, which fits his personality. My wife said, I don't even want to get out of the car. I mean, the people grilling the burgers, he said, in order to get them to come, he said, I got to feed them. So they're grilling these burgers. And she said, man, they look like they just got off the Hells Angels motorcycles. I mean, that's the whole crowd. I said, Sharon, you got to get out of the car. We got to go do this. Well, he didn't have a wife at that time. And about every single thing that I'm thinking to myself, boy, you need to do this, you need to do this, you need to do this. My wife kept saying, if he had a wife, he would have done that. If he had a wife, he would have done that. And so my wife started praying that he would get a wife, and thank God that woman that he's sitting next to is the wife. That's the building he's got. You can see the fence around it, because if you don't have that, they're going to destroy the property. But he got that, and you don't see the next building, but he actually bought a second building in addition to that they've made their children's ministry in. That's a picture of the auditorium. There may be one more, I'm not sure. I didn't put these together, so that's why I'm just... And at any rate, so that is quite the story there. But that church is now 20 years old, believe it or not, doing really well. I end with this last picture. 40 years ago, I went to help start a church in Toms River, New Jersey. The pastor who was there, wanting to start the church, didn't know anything about planning a church, and he was a friend of mine in Bible college. So he said, can you come and help us start this church? I said yes. So I stepped aside from the ministry we had going, invested time in getting this church going. And I show you this picture because now this is 40 years. Every 5 years I go back, and at least every fifth anniversary, I go back and preach in this church. So I was just there in November for the 40th anniversary of this church. But you can see that building is a gymnasium that they have. Let's go to the next building. That's the original building that they built, and then the next one, I think, is the third building in between, kind of a connection building between those two. So that's after 40 years. There may be another picture or two. There's one that I want you, and you see the wall with all those pictures. Those are all the missionaries that they support. And so, folks, when we talk about planting a church, it isn't just, planting a church. It's planting a church that will support missionaries and reproduce themselves and see other churches come forth. And so that is really kind of the end goal of what we're striving to do. So that is our heartbeat. That is what we're involved in. And you, as I said, support us and pray for us. And I'm very, very thankful for that. My wife is as well. She always says this: when you put on your shoes, pray for the shoemakers. That's her little spiel. When you put on your shoes, pray for the shoemaker. Now, we do have some prayer cards out at the tables, a couple of different places. The visitors thing, we put some there. You can pick them up. I was speaking in a church, and a lady came up to me, and this is before I knew my wife made this statement, and she said, I just want you to know, when I put on my shoes today, I prayed for the shoemakers. I thought that was an odd thing to say. And I said, well, ma'am, I appreciate that. Well, I got home, and I said, Sharon, I'm going to tell you this lady came up to me and said this. Well, my wife had done a ladies' retreat there, and she made that statement, when you put on your shoes, pray for the shoemakers. I didn't know she was saying that around the country. So she says, well, you idiot, that's what I asked the women to do. Well, I said, well, praise the Lord. So I don't know that the men are going to do that, so you ladies got to help me out now. And when I get home, my wife is going to say, did you tell them? I promise you, everywhere I go, did you tell them? And I'm going to be able to, yes, I told him, when you put on your shoes, pray for the shoemakers. We appreciate that so much. Looking forward to a good service this morning. Brother Steve, come up and do what you need to do. Amen. There you go. Hey, you got it.
There's a bunch of them. Or if you go by a sign that says barber, just pray for the barber. That's everything be better. All right. Well, thank you, Doc, so much. I appreciate that. Church will start in about 20 minutes, and so